This video has been designed to give an overview of benchmarking and flags, how they're calculated and how they're used in TEF Year 4. This video is part of a wider series of videos that we've published to support higher education providers and students in Year 4 of the TEF. This video on benchmarking and significance flags goes into some of the technical detail about how we use data, so you might want to have watched some of the introductory videos first. In particular, you'll find it useful to have watched the previous video on metrics. We published TEF Year 4 procedural guidance on the 22nd of October 2018. It updates, supplements and should be read alongside the TEF specification, which was published by the DFE in October 2017. The videos then are designed to highlight key information from the guidance in an easy to access format, but they don't themselves provide definitive guidance. For definitive guidance, please see these two documents. There's a further list of key information sources at the end of this video. In a previous video, we talked through the metrics that make up each row of a TEF metrics workbook, the data that forms them, and how the indicators are arrived at. The next thing to talk about is the benchmarks. So a metric consists of four things: an indicator, a difference, a benchmark, and a Z-score, and I'll deal with each of these in this video. The benchmark column is highlighted in the workbook here, and I'll describe exactly what they are and what their purpose is. A point to note that the workbook we're showing here and the other workbook screenshots that we'll use throughout the video are in the format used for the Year 4 provider level exercise. The subject pilot workbooks look slightly different, but all the benchmarking information is displayed in the same way. So the purpose of benchmarking is to allow a fair comparison between providers by controlling for factors that might affect the metrics but that are outside of a provider's control. For example, we know that students doing medicine or nursing are very likely to go into employment, and indeed very likely to go into highly skilled employment, far more so on average across the sector than perhaps students in some other subjects. So if we didn't make any sort of benchmarking comparison, providers could appear to be performing particularly well or particularly poorly based purely on the mix of students or the mix of subjects that they have. The metrics wouldn't be a fair measure of the provider's actual performance without benchmarking. The TEF methodology also recognises that benchmarking doesn't tell the whole story. There are times when there might be very high or very low absolute performance. We'll deal with that and how it plays into the TEF assessment in a subsequent video. So what are the benchmarks? They are effectively a weighted sector average that we calculate, where the weightings are based on the characteristics of the students at your provider. They're individual to each institution, for each metric, and for each split of the metrics. They're based on the data for all providers that we have data for, not just those who might be making a TEF application in that year. So they're not affected by who chooses to apply. They are effectively, as I say, an average for similar students in similar subjects. So what do we mean by similar students and similar subjects? What are the things that count as similar for these purposes? This table lists out the benchmarking factors that we take into consideration. Across the top we have each of the metrics, and down the side we have each of the benchmarking factors that we take into account. While these were updated between TEF Year 2 and Year 3, there's only one minor change between TEF Years 3 and Year 4. That change has been to update the Polar benchmarking factor to use the more recent Polar 4 classification. We believe that the impact of this change should be minimal, but if you're looking at your metrics and thinking, why has the benchmark changed when all of the underlying data is the same, be aware that this might have resulted from the change in the benchmarking factors. However, also remember that benchmarking calculations use data from all providers in the sector. So if someone else's underlying data has changed, this could also be responsible for a change that you're seeing in your benchmark. So how do we decide which factors to take into account? We know that some factors affect some aspects of the data but not others. So there are some general rules. To be selected, benchmarking factors must be associated with what's being measured. They must vary significantly from one HE provider to another, and there must be strong evidence of influences other than provider performance affecting the outcomes. You'll notice that we don't include anything on region, particularly in the employment statistics, and that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, including region in the benchmarking would mean that TEF would no longer compare providers across the UK. Providers in each region would only be compared with others in that region. This significantly increases the likelihood that we'd be benchmarking a provider against themselves when you can consider that the number of unique combinations we have in benchmarking already runs into the tens of thousands. The benchmarking groups would become far smaller and would compromise the robustness of the statistical calculations used in benchmarking. Technical considerations aside, it's also worth noting the challenges in separating out regional effects from other issues, such as having a large number of local or less mobile students, which, for example, is the case in many providers within London, but also for many providers not in London. There is some contextual information to support assessors in making sense of regional variations in terms of employment patterns instead. Other things to note in terms of benchmarking: the difference between a benchmark and the indicator is very important, as are the Z-scores and standard deviations. I'll talk a little bit more about all of those in a minute. It's important to note as well that we have a benchmark for each split of a metric. When we calculate these, we only factor in the outcomes for students in that split. For example, there is a sex split, and when we calculate the benchmark for male students, we only include male students. Similarly, for the female split, we only include female students. It's possible that this approach leads to the appearance of flags that you might not immediately expect. For example, you might see negatives in both the male and the female splits, but not in the overall core metric. These sorts of difference can occur, and it's due to the fact that the benchmark is for the split based on students within that characteristic in common. You're making a different set of comparisons. Notwithstanding any amendments that might happen, the benchmarking rates are now fixed for TEF Year 4 as of the 22nd of October release. So if you don't plan on making a data amendment, your benchmarking and indeed your metrics in totality will not change. Finally, we've published a set of sector averages that would allow you to go away and work out exactly how your benchmarks were arrived at, along with the individualized data that we've provided to you. There's a link here to a page on the OFS website where that is published. And I'm just going to open a copy of this sector averages worksheet to show you how it works. So what we've got here is a screenshot from the sector averages workbook. It shows the average performance of different groups of students across the sector. Each tab of the workbook looks at a different metric. This is the first tab. It's looking at academic support, which is a metric drawn from the NSS, and it's looking at full-time students. You can see along the bottom that the other metrics are available on the other tabs, firstly for full-time students, then again separately for part-time students. In each tab, in each worksheet, the first few columns show the different benchmarking factors that define different types of students. In this screenshot, I've hidden some of the ones that don't apply to the NSS. And if we look at the top row of this particular worksheet, you can see that we're looking firstly at students in medicine and dentistry who are 21 years old and over, who are Asian, who are not disabled, and who are studying on a first degree course. And because this is the NSS and it's benchmarked by year, this is for students who completed the 2016 NSS. So we can see that for this type of student in that year, the average satisfaction with academic support was 84.3% across the sector. Each line of this spreadsheet looks at a slightly different group of students. So the next line down is looking at students who completed students with the same characteristics who completed the survey in 2017. Then a little bit further down, we start to look at students who are on other undergraduate courses rather than those on first degree courses. Further down, we start to look at students with different characteristics, so disabled students and black students. And if you carry on down this spreadsheet, you would start to see different subjects as well. So this exercise is repeated to create a unique benchmark for each type of student in each subject. And if you went all the way down to the bottom of this spreadsheet, you'd see there's around 3,300 unique benchmarking groups just for this metric for full-time students. And we use this and the data that we hold about each provider's student body to construct a unique benchmark for each provider. So I'm going to take a couple of slides here to illustrate a worked example of how we might calculate a provider's benchmark. Here we have a very simplified example that just uses two benchmarking factors, age and subject. And for the purposes of the example, we've limited it to 2 age categories and 3 subjects, agriculture, history and maths. So this table presents a fictional provider that has 1,090 students, and the table shows how many of each type of student they have and what the actual continuation rate for each group of students was. Overall, this provider has a continuation indicator of 94.3%. So the second table shows the same information but for the entire higher education sector. If we compare the overall continuation rates, you can see for the entire sector the continuation rate is 96.6%, which, if you remember, is a bit higher than the provider's indicator of 94.3%. So it looks like the provider's continuation rate is quite a bit lower than the rest of the sector. But we can see from this table that there are a few differences in the profile of students across the sector compared to what we saw at the provider. Firstly, obviously there are far more students in the entire sector, but also the distribution of those students across the different subject categories are really rather different. For example, the provider on the previous slide didn't have any history students, which account for a large amount of students in the sector as a whole. The provider also had a much greater proportion of agriculture students and a smaller proportion of maths students than is the pattern in the rest of the sector. So this table shows the individual continuation rates for each group of students and subjects. These are the equivalent of the sector averages that we looked at in the Excel table earlier. So we can use these sector averages to calculate a benchmark for the provider that will give us a more accurate insight into the performance of the provider than if we just compare the sector average to the provider's overall continuation rate. So this table goes back to the provider's data and continuation rates. In order to then work out the provider's unique benchmark, we calculate for each group of students, i.e. for each row in the table, the proportion of a provider's students that that group represents, and then multiply it by the sector-wide continuation rate from the previous slide. So for example, in the first line, young agriculture students represent 45.9% of the provider's students. We multiply that by the sector continuation rate for that type of students, which we saw on the last slide was 95%. That gives us a weighted sector figure. We apply that calculation to each of the different combinations of age and subject, i.e. each row of the table, and adding up the different weighted sector figures gives us the provider's benchmark, which is based on the characteristics of students and subjects at the provider. Here, it gives the provider a benchmark of 94.7%. Importantly, you can see that the provider's benchmark in this case is quite different from the sector average for continuation. Based on the numbers and types of student the provider teaches, we wouldn't expect it to get a continuation rate as high as the rest of the sector. What we would actually expect is its benchmark, which is a continuation rate of 94.7%. As a reminder, the provider's indicator, the actual continuation rate it achieved was 94.3%, so it's performing broadly in line with what we might expect given the mixture of students and subjects that it has. Although the provider's slightly below its benchmark, it's not what we would define as materially or significantly different. It wouldn't meet any of the thresholds to generate a flag. If we'd just been comparing the provider's indicator to the sector average without taking into account age or subject, this difference would have appeared a lot bigger. Real benchmarking has many more factors and many more categories within those factors, but the general principles are the same as this example. There is a sector rate of performance for each group of students. we calculate what proportion of a provider's students within that group, and then we multiply the two together. So we've looked in detail at benchmarking, and the worked example I just showed you illustrates how the benchmarks are calculated and how we use them to compare a provider's expected performance with its actual performance, its indicator. And that comparison is shown in the workbook as the difference column. So that's covered the indicator, the benchmark, and the difference. Now we're going to move on to Z-scores. So I'll describe these in a little bit more detail now. This does get rather technical. Again, we're looking at a Year 4 provider level workbook, but the Z-score column is the same in the pilots. So it's not automatically clear whether the difference between an indicator and a benchmark is statistically significant. The number of students contributing to the indicator and the spread of the data will affect whether the difference is statistically significant, and that determines the number of standard deviations that a provider's indicator is away from the benchmark. The biggest driver in determining whether a difference is statistically significant or not is by far the number of students at the provider. The rest has a largely second-order effect. So we convert the number of standard deviations into a Z-score, and the Z-score is what we then use to determine whether the difference between an indicator and the benchmark is statistically significant. We use two different Z-score values to generate flags. Where the difference between the benchmark and an indicator generates a Z-score of plus or minus 1.96, then we say it's statistically significant, and that is testing statistical significance at the 5% level. There's then a further test as to whether the Z-score is plus or minus 3 to get a double flag, and I'll talk more about these in a second. What's important to note here is that a Z-score of greater than plus or minus 3 does not indicate any greater significance. Once you've hit a Z-score of 3 in either direction, we conclude that your indicator is definitely statistically significantly different from your benchmark. So Z-scores that are very large in magnitude will be treated no differently to a Z-score of plus or minus 3 when the assessors make their assessment. As mentioned, we use Z-scores to generate flags. Flags are used in the workbook to denote where a provider's performance is meaningfully above or below what you might expect. For a metric to be flagged, it needs to be both materially different and statistically significantly different from the expected benchmark performance. So what that means is that to get a plus, or a single positive flag, you need a Z-score of greater than 1.96, we say plus 2 here for brevity, and it needs to be 2 percentage points above the indicator. If both of those points are true, a metric will get a single positive flag. On the other hand, if a metric is below benchmark by 2 percentage points or more, and the Z-score is greater than 1.96 in magnitude, it will receive a single negative flag. If you happen to have a really high benchmark of something above 97%, we ignore the 2 percentage points test, and you just need to have the 1.96 Z-score to get a positive flag. To get a double positive flag, the plus, you need to have a Z-score of greater than 3 and a difference of greater than 3 percentage points. Again, that materiality test is ignored if your benchmark is above 97%, because if we didn't do that, it would be impossible to get a double positive flag in that situation. It's worth noting at this point that for the purposes of calculating the initial hypothesis, a plus and a plus are both still one flag, so a single flag and a double flag both count the same as 1, or in the case of the NSS metrics, a half. Double flags do give a stronger signal of performance, but when we're formulaically calculating the initial hypothesis, they're no different. They still count as 1 or a half, depending on the metric. In addition to the number of flags, assessors will consider how the flags are distributed across the 3 aspects of quality, and more information about how the assessors will approach interpreting the flags can be found in the guidance and in the videos about the assessment process. So just to reiterate, this is how the flags are displayed in the metric workbook. For its full-time provision, this provider has a couple of positively flagged core metrics where the provider's indicator is above benchmark and the material difference and the Z-score both exceed 2. For its part-time provision, it has one negative flag where its indicator is below benchmark and the difference in Z-score exceed 2 in the opposite direction. This is a good example of the need to meet both the materiality and the significance thresholds to get a certain type of flag. You can see for some of these metrics the material difference is really large, 8 or 9 percentage points for a couple of the metrics. But the Z-scores, the measure of statistical significance, don't quite meet the threshold of 3 for these metrics to get a double flag. So both conditions have to be met to get a certain type of flag. So these metrics are only statistically significant enough to receive single flags. As mentioned, we calculate benchmarks and generate flags for all the split metric categories as well as for the core metrics. And this is what it looks like in the workbook. As well as the flags for the split metrics, you can find the detail that contribute to these flags, for example the Z-scores and the differences, on the other tabs of the metric workbooks. I've included a question on flags here to test your understanding. So here's a set of metrics with differences and Z-scores displayed but no flags. And the question for you is, what flags would these metrics receive? I suggest taking a minute to go through one by one and work out what you think the answer is in each case. So pause the video here, make a note of your answers, and then when you're ready, press play and see if you got them right. And here are the answers. So only the academic support metric gets a flag, and it's a single positive flag. The first two metrics are statistically significant but don't meet the materiality threshold of plus or minus 2 percentage points difference, and the last two metrics are above the materiality threshold but can't be classed as statistically significant. So having looked through these differences in Z-scores, I'd then ask you, how would you rank these metrics in terms of performance from best to worst? The answer's not necessarily what you might think at first glance, and I'll just talk through some of the considerations now. So in first place would have to be the academic support metric. It's the only one that gets a positive flag, so that comes first. But what comes next? You might be tempted to say employment because it's got the largest positive difference. But the low Z-score here means that we can't say that this difference is not just down to random chance. Although it's got a large difference above its benchmark, this difference isn't statistically significant. So of the two metrics that do have statistically significant differences, that's the first two, teaching on my course has the largest positive material difference, so that comes second. You might have noticed that assessment and feedback has a very large Z-score of 7.2, but remember that Z-scores above 3 don't really add any more confidence. There's virtually no difference in the confidence we have between the teaching and the assessment and feedback metrics in this case. The other two are actually tied in last place. Although one's positive and one's negative in terms of the material difference, both the Z-scores here mean that we can't be sure that these differences aren't just a result of random chance, so we have to disregard the difference between indicator and benchmark. In practice, the assessors would look at the entire picture for these metrics, the flags on the split metrics, they'd look for very high or low absolute performance, and it might be that based on that more rounded picture, they indeed identify that employment is a slightly better performer than continuation. But purely based on the information provided in this table, we have to say that there's no difference between these two metrics. Hopefully this video has provided a helpful overview of benchmarking and significance flags. However, it is just a summary. Full and definitive information about how the assessment process works and how we use data is included in the guidance documents for TEF Year 4 that are published on the OFS website. Any provider thinking about applying to TEF Year 4 should read the guidance in full. You can also find the other videos in the series published on the OFS website. Web links and contact information for the Office for Students are given on the screen on the left, but for inquiries about TEF policy, you should contact the Department for Education in England. You may reuse the content of this video under the terms of the Open Government Licence. If you adapt the slides, you should be aware that the content cannot be used in a way that suggests the OFS endorses you or the use of the information. Thank you for listening.